Imagine being locked in an Israeli prison, sentenced to 15 years for terrorism. Then one day, a fellow Palestinian prisoner whispers something that changes everything. He's actually a Mossad agent, and he wants you to work for him. This isn't fiction. This is the story of one of the most audacious intelligence operations in modern history. How Israel's Mossad planted a false inmate inside Gaza's most dangerous territory, turning the prison system into a recruitment ground for spies who would later help hunt down Hamas leaders. What you're about to hear sounds like a Hollywood thriller, but every word is documented reality. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by real espionage operations and the hidden wars fought in the shadows, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These stories take weeks to research, and your support helps us bring you the most detailed intelligence breakdowns on YouTube. Now, let's enter the world where nothing is as it seems. Chapter 1. The Prison Laboratory. The story begins in a place most people never think about, the Israeli prison system. To understand how Mossad infiltrated Hamas, you first need to understand that Israeli prisons holding Palestinian inmates aren't just detention centers. They're intelligence gold mines. Thousands of Palestinians pass through these facilities, many with connections to Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other militant organizations. For Israeli intelligence, these prisons represent something extraordinary, a controlled environment where potential assets can be identified, assessed, and recruited without the chaos of the outside world. The operation we're discussing today centered on a technique called false flag recruitment, and it required something most intelligence agencies would consider too risky, creating a completely fabricated prisoner identity and inserting this fake inmate into the general prison population. The asset in question, we'll call him Mahmoud because his real identity remains classified, was actually a Mossad operative who had been meticulously prepared for one of the most dangerous undercover assignments imaginable. Mahmoud's backstory was perfect. He had documentation showing arrests for stone throwing as a teenager, escalating to weapons possession, and finally a conviction for attempted attack on Israeli soldiers. His family history was real. Mossad had identified an actual Palestinian family whose son had died years earlier in circumstances that were poorly documented. They essentially gave Mahmoud this dead man's identity, complete with forged prison records, court documents, and even planted memories among a few corrupt officials who could verify his story if questioned. The preparation was extraordinary. Mahmoud spent 18 months learning not just Arabic, which he already spoke, but the specific dialect of the Gaza Strip. He memorized street names, neighborhood politics, family rivalries, and even the locations of specific shops and mosques. He studied Islamic theology to the level where he could debate Quranic interpretation with Hamas religious authorities. He learned the prison culture, the hierarchies, the codes, the way inmates communicate through seemingly innocent conversations. Most critically, he learned how to build trust in an environment where everyone suspects everyone else of being an informant. When Mahmoud entered the prison system, he was placed in a facility holding mid-level Palestinian security prisoners, not the high-value Hamas commanders in maximum security, but the layer just below them. These were the rising stars of the organization, young men who had proven themselves in operations but hadn't yet reached the leadership levels that would make them more carefully vetted. This was deliberate. Mossad knew that recruiting established Hamas leaders would be nearly impossible, but these younger operatives, especially those facing long sentences and feeling abandoned by their organization, represented softer targets. Mahmoud's mission was patient and methodical. He didn't approach anyone directly about working with Israel. That would have been suicide. Instead, he began building relationships, establishing himself as a committed resistance fighter who was bitter about his long sentence. He complained about the same things other inmates complained about: poor conditions, feelings of abandonment, worries about family members outside. He participated in the prison's internal Palestinian political structure, joining the Hamas bloc and attending their discussions and prayers. To everyone around him, he was simply another Palestinian prisoner enduring the grinding reality of Israeli detention. But Mahmoud was doing something else, something invisible to his fellow inmates. He was assessing, categorizing, and identifying potential recruitment targets. He looked for specific psychological profiles: prisoners who showed signs of disillusionment, those with serious family problems requiring money, individuals with egos that could be manipulated, and especially those who exhibited moral flexibility despite their political commitments. He documented everything through a communication system with his handlers that was so carefully constructed that even today its exact nature remains classified. Some reports suggest he used corrupted guards. Others indicate he had access to hidden communication devices. What we know for certain is that information flowed regularly from Mahmoud to Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. The beauty of Mahmoud's position was that he could do something Israeli interrogators could never accomplish. He could have long, unguarded conversations with Hamas members in moments when their psychological defenses were down. In the middle of the night, when prisoners couldn't sleep and talked about their fears and regrets. During family visit days, when men returned to their cells devastated by seeing their children growing up without them. In those vulnerable moments, Mahmoud would listen, remember, and report everything. He was building dossiers on dozens of Hamas operatives, identifying their weaknesses, their pressure points, their potential value as intelligence sources. Chapter 2. The Recruitment. After 8 months of careful observation, Mahmoud identified his primary target, a 29-year-old Hamas operative named Youssef, who was serving a 12-year sentence for weapons smuggling. Youssef was perfect for recruitment because he embodied multiple vulnerability factors. He had a wife and 3 young children in Gaza who were struggling financially. His own family had essentially disowned him after his arrest, viewing his capture as a failure that brought shame. Hamas had initially promised to support his family, but the payments had become irregular and insufficient. Perhaps most importantly, Youssef had an ego. He believed he was smarter and more capable than many of the Hamas leaders who had avoided capture, and he resented that his talents were being wasted in an Israeli prison. The recruitment didn't happen with a single conversation. It evolved through months of carefully calibrated interactions. Mahmoud began by simply being a good friend, someone who listened when Youssef complained about his family situation, who shared food packages, who could discuss military tactics and resistance strategy at a level that impressed Youssef. He never suggested anything improper. He simply became the person Youssef trusted most in that prison environment. The breakthrough came during a family visit that went disastrously wrong for Youssef. His wife had brought their children to the prison, and his youngest daughter, who had been an infant at his arrest, didn't recognize him and cried when he tried to hold her. Youssef returned to his cell, emotionally devastated. That evening he broke down crying in front of Mahmoud, saying he felt like a ghost to his own family, that his sacrifice for Hamas meant nothing, that he was rotting in prison while Hamas leaders lived in luxury in Qatar and Turkey. This was the moment Mahmoud had been engineering for months, but he didn't pounce. Instead, he consoled Youssef, agreed with his frustrations, and simply planted a seed. Sometimes I think about what I would do if I could somehow make things better for my family, Mahmoud said carefully, even if it meant complicated choices. He left it hanging there, ambiguous enough to be deniable if Youssef reacted negatively. Youssef didn't react negatively. Over the next 2 weeks, he began making similar comments. testing whether Mahmoud was suggesting what he thought he was suggesting. The conversations became progressively more explicit, always initiated by Youssef, always with Mahmoud playing the role of someone equally conflicted and uncertain. This was textbook recruitment technique, making the target feel like they were convincing the recruiter rather than the other way around. Finally, Mahmoud revealed his true purpose, but in a way that was carefully designed. He told Youssef that he had been approached by Israeli intelligence before his imprisonment, that they knew about his family situation, that they could offer substantial help, but that he, Mahmoud, was conflicted about whether cooperation was betrayal or simply practical survival. He framed it as seeking Youssef's advice, when in reality he was making an offer. The negotiation that followed was fascinating. Youssef didn't immediately agree, but he didn't refuse either. He asked questions. What would be required? How much money? How would his family receive it without suspicion? What kind of information would Israel want? Could he be released early? Mahmoud, following his training, didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He was honest. Cooperation would mean providing information about Hamas operations, identifying targets, possibly even participating in operations after release. The money would be substantial, but not unrealistic, enough to transform his family's situation. Early release was possible, but not guaranteed. There would be risks, but those risks could be managed. What closed the deal wasn't the money or the possibility of release. It was something more emotional. Mahmoud arranged, through his handlers, for Youssef to receive, through supposedly normal channels, a letter from his daughter's teacher saying she was struggling in school because of behavioral problems related to missing her father, and suggesting the family might benefit from financial counseling. The letter was fake, created by Mossad, but it touched Youssef's deepest fear, that his imprisonment was destroying his children's futures. 3 days later, Youssef agreed to cooperate, but he didn't know the full picture. He believed Mahmoud was a fellow Palestinian prisoner who had been recruited by Israeli intelligence. He didn't know that Mahmoud was actually a deep-cover Mossad operative. This layer of deception was crucial because it meant Youssef was reporting to someone he perceived as equally compromised, which made him more willing to share information without feeling like he was directly dealing with the enemy. The information Youssef provided was immediately valuable. He had detailed knowledge of Hamas smuggling operations along the Egyptian border, including the locations of tunnel networks, the names of Egyptian security officials who had been bribed, and the schedules of weapons transfers. He knew the internal politics of Hamas military wing in Gaza, including rivalries between different commanders that Israeli intelligence could potentially exploit. He provided information about Hamas training camps, weapons storage facilities, and the command structure for rocket operations. But Mossad wanted more than just information. They wanted Youssef positioned to provide intelligence after his release, which was still years away. So Mahmoud began coaching him on what kind of connections to maintain through prison communications, which Hamas figures to stay close to, and how to position himself as a valuable operative upon release. Youssef, believing he was partnering with a fellow recruited prisoner, followed this guidance, not realizing he was being shaped into a long-term intelligence asset who would eventually help Israel target Hamas operations from inside Gaza itself. The relationship between Mahmoud and Youssef had become the prototype for something larger. Mossad realized they could replicate this model, using Mahmoud to recruit multiple assets within the prison system, creating a network of compromised Hamas operatives who would eventually be released back into Gaza, carrying Israeli intelligence's reach into the heart of Palestinian militant organizations. Chapter 3. The network expands. The success with Youssef transformed Mahmoud's mission from a single recruitment operation into something far more ambitious. the systematic penetration of Hamas through the Israeli prison system. Over the next 2 years, Mahmoud identified and recruited 7 additional Hamas operatives, each chosen for different capabilities and access within the organization. This wasn't random selection. Each recruitment was carefully planned based on intelligence requirements and the specific roles these individuals could play once released. The second recruit was a Hamas communications specialist named Saleh, who had expertise in encrypted communications and digital security. Saleh's value was technical. He understood how Hamas operatives communicated securely, what encryption methods they used, and most critically, where the vulnerabilities in their systems existed. His recruitment followed a different pattern than Youssef's. Saleh was intellectual and ideological, less motivated by money than by a growing disillusionment with Hamas leadership. Mahmoud engaged him in philosophical debates about resistance, sacrifice, and the future of Palestine, gradually revealing contradictions and failures in Hamas strategy that Saleh himself had privately questioned. The turning point with Saleh came when Mahmoud shared, supposedly from another source, intelligence about Hamas leadership living in luxury in Qatar, while operatives like Saleh sacrificed everything. The information was real, deliberately provided by Mossad because they knew it would resonate. Saleh began to see cooperation not as betrayal, but as a form of pragmatic resistance, helping Israel target the corrupt elements of Hamas while protecting Palestinian civilians. It was moral rationalization, but it was effective. Saleh agreed to provide technical intelligence about Hamas communications infrastructure, information that would later prove crucial in targeted operations. The third recruit was different still. A low-level Hamas political organizer named Khaled, who had extensive connections in Gaza's civilian bureaucracy. Khaled's value wasn't military intelligence, but human intelligence. He knew who was related to whom, which families were loyal to Hamas, which civilian officials could be pressured, and where Hamas operatives lived and socialized. His recruitment was purely mercenary. Khaled had gambling debts and a mistress his wife didn't know about. Mahmoud, through his network, arranged for both problems to be discovered by other inmates, creating enormous pressure on Khaled. The offer was simple: financial rescue and protection of his secrets in exchange for cooperation. Khaled accepted without much ideological struggle. The recruitment methods varied because Mossad understood that different psychological profiles required different approaches. Some targets needed money, others needed ideological justification, some responded to blackmail, and a few were motivated by revenge against Hamas leaders who they felt had wronged them. Mahmoud became skilled at identifying which approach would work with each potential asset, and his handlers provided whatever resources were necessary to close the deal. But the operation faced a critical challenge: security. Every recruitment increased the risk of exposure. If even one recruited operative betrayed the network to Hamas, not only would Mahmoud's cover be blown, but the entire apparatus would collapse. Hamas had its own internal security service that was paranoid about Israeli infiltration, and they regularly interrogated released prisoners to identify possible collaborators. Mossad needed a security architecture that would protect both Mahmoud and his recruited network. The solution was compartmentalization and layered deception. None of the recruited prisoners knew about the others. Each believed they were Mahmoud's only recruit. More importantly, even after learning that Mahmoud was facilitating Israeli cooperation, most recruits still didn't know he was actually a Mossad operative rather than a turned Palestinian prisoner. This meant that if any recruit was exposed and interrogated by Hamas, they couldn't reveal the full scope of the operation because they didn't know it themselves. Communication protocols were equally sophisticated. Mahmoud didn't communicate directly with Israeli handlers in ways that could be observed. Instead, he used a system of cutouts, intermediaries, who passed information without knowing its full significance. Some of these were corrupted guards who thought they were simply passing messages for money without understanding they were facilitating espionage. Others were Palestinian inmates who were unknowingly used as message carriers, moving information in codes they couldn't recognize. The recruited assets themselves were prepared for their eventual release with extraordinary care. Each was given specific instructions on how to reintegrate into Gaza society without raising suspicion, how to rebuild their Hamas credentials, and how to eventually make contact with Israeli intelligence once outside prison. They were taught basic counter-surveillance techniques, how to recognize Hamas internal security monitoring, and most critically, how to maintain psychological compartmentalization, living as committed Hamas members while secretly working for Israeli intelligence. The genius of the operation was that it converted Israeli prisons from Hamas recruiting grounds, which is what they had traditionally been, into Israeli recruiting grounds. Hamas often celebrated the prison experience as radicalizing and strengthening their operatives' commitment. They didn't realize that the same environment was being systematically exploited to turn their members into intelligence sources. As the recruited operatives began to be released, the operation entered its most dangerous phase. Each release was carefully monitored by both Hamas and Israeli intelligence. Hamas would conduct debriefings to check for signs of compromise. Israel would establish contact protocols to begin intelligence collection. The first releases were treated as test cases. If any showed signs of having been exposed, Mossad would have had to abort the entire operation and extract Mahmoud immediately. The first 3 releases went smoothly. The operatives successfully reintegrated into Gaza, re-established their Hamas connections, and began providing intelligence through secure channels. They reported on weapons storage locations, planned operations, and internal Hamas discussions. The intelligence was valuable, but more importantly, it validated the entire methodology. Mossad now had proof that the prison recruitment system worked and could be sustained. By this point, Mahmoud had been undercover in the Israeli prison system for nearly 3 years. The psychological toll was enormous. He was living a complete lie, surrounded by people who would kill him instantly if they knew his true identity, building relationships that were fundamentally manipulative, and bearing the weight of knowing that the intelligence he gathered would lead to operations that would kill some of the very people he had befriended. Chapter 4. The Payoff and the Aftermath. The ultimate validation of Mahmoud's operation came in the years following the initial releases of recruited assets back into Gaza. The intelligence network he had built inside Israeli prisons began producing results that shaped major Israeli operations against Hamas. Between the recruitment phase and the eventual exposure of parts of the network, this prison-based espionage apparatus contributed to numerous high-value operations, including the targeting of Hamas commanders, the destruction of weapons infrastructure, and the prevention of planned attacks against Israeli civilians. One of the most significant successes involved Youssef, the first recruit. After his release in a prisoner exchange negotiated by international mediators, Youssef successfully reintegrated into Hamas operations in Gaza. His technical knowledge of smuggling networks made him valuable to the organization, and he was assigned to coordinate weapons transfers through the Egyptian border tunnels. For Israeli intelligence, this was perfect placement. Youssef provided real-time information about weapons shipments, allowing the Israeli Air Force to conduct precision strikes on specific tunnel locations immediately after weapons had been moved through, but before they could be distributed to operational units. In one documented case, Youssef reported that a significant shipment of advanced anti-tank missiles had been moved through a tunnel network near Rafah and was temporarily stored in a warehouse before distribution. Israeli intelligence verified the information through independent surveillance, then conducted a nighttime airstrike that destroyed the weapons cache. Hamas lost a critical weapons shipment, but more importantly, they had no reason to suspect internal betrayal because the strike could be explained by routine Israeli surveillance. This was the beauty of the intelligence Youssef provided. It was actionable, but didn't expose him as the source. Saleh, the communication specialist, provided a different kind of value. His technical knowledge allowed Israeli signals intelligence to penetrate Hamas encrypted communications in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. He identified specific vulnerabilities in the encryption software Hamas used, explained how their communications hierarchy functioned, and even provided information about which Hamas operatives were careless with operational security. This intelligence contributed to the interception of numerous Hamas communications, providing strategic intelligence about organizational planning and internal politics. Perhaps most valuable was the human intelligence network that developed from Khaled's connections in Gaza's civilian bureaucracy. Khaled provided information that allowed Mossad to map the entire social network surrounding Hamas operations. Who was related to whom, which seemingly civilian officials were actually Hamas operatives, where Hamas commanders lived, and how they moved through Gaza. This human terrain mapping became crucial for targeted operations, allowing Israeli intelligence to track high-value targets through their social connections rather than relying solely on technical surveillance. But the operation couldn't last forever. In intelligence work, every network eventually faces exposure. The beginning of the end came when a Hamas internal security investigation, triggered by a separate incident, began looking more carefully at Palestinians who had been released from Israeli prisons in recent years. Hamas security services had become increasingly sophisticated in their counterintelligence efforts, partly in response to repeated Israeli successes that suggested internal penetration. The investigation focused initially on patterns, which released prisoners had been near operations that were subsequently targeted by Israel, who had unexplained income or resources, who seemed too eager to volunteer for sensitive assignments. Khaled, whose mercenary nature made him less careful, became a focus of suspicion. Hamas internal security began following him, monitoring his communications, and eventually set a trap by feeding him false information about a supposed weapons cache location. When that location was struck by Israeli aircraft, despite being actually empty, Hamas knew with certainty they had identified a collaborator. Khaled was arrested by Hamas internal security and interrogated. Under extreme pressure, and Hamas interrogation methods are brutal, he revealed his recruitment by someone in Israeli prison, though because of the compartmentalization built into Mahmoud's operation, he couldn't provide details about other recruits or the full scope of the network. Hamas security services began expanding their investigation, looking at other prisoners who'd been held in the same facilities during overlapping periods. Mossad, monitoring the situation through separate intelligence sources, realized the network was compromised. They activated emergency extraction protocols for their assets, but in the closed environment of Gaza, extraction is extraordinarily difficult. Some of the recruited operatives managed to escape through Egypt with Mossad assistance. Others went underground within Gaza, trying to disappear into the civilian population. At least 2 were captured by Hamas. Their fates remain unknown, but are presumed to have ended in execution after interrogation. The critical question was Mahmoud himself. His deep cover identity had been so carefully constructed that even under the investigation, Hamas didn't immediately identify him as the central recruiter, but Mossad couldn't take chances. Mahmoud was extracted from Israeli prison through an elaborate staged escape that made it appear he had simply managed to break out, avoiding any suggestion of Israeli facilitation that might have revealed his true role. The aftermath of the operation is still being assessed. Hamas conducted a major internal purge, arresting dozens of individuals suspected of Israeli collaboration. The paranoia this created within Hamas ranks actually served Israeli intelligence interests by making the organization less cohesive and more distrustful internally. The intelligence gathered through the network continued to provide value even after the operatives themselves were compromised, because the information about Hamas structures, procedures, and personnel remained accurate. For Mahmoud personally, the operation ended with his relocation under a new identity, reportedly somewhere outside the Middle East. The psychological cost of 3 years living under complete cover, building relationships designed to manipulate vulnerable people, and bearing responsibility for operations that resulted in deaths, is something only he can fully understand. Intelligence officers describe such deep cover operations as among the most psychologically demanding assignments in espionage. The broader implications of the operation extend beyond its tactical successes. It demonstrated that Israeli prisons, rather than being radicalization centers that strengthen Hamas, could be converted into intelligence collection environments. It showed that even ideologically committed militants have vulnerabilities that can be exploited given the right circumstances, time, and psychological approach. And it validated the use of false flag operations using fake identities to penetrate organizations from within as an effective methodology in the modern intelligence landscape. The operation also revealed the fundamental challenge in asymmetric conflicts. Organizations like Hamas operate in closed societies where information control is possible, but that same closure creates vulnerabilities when penetrated. Every Hamas member has family pressures, financial needs, ego vulnerabilities, or ideological doubts that can potentially be exploited by sophisticated intelligence services with the patience and resources to identify and manipulate those weaknesses. Today, the Mossad prison recruitment methodology continues, though its specific techniques have necessarily evolved as Hamas and other organizations have learned from this penetration and adjusted their counterintelligence procedures. The cat-and-mouse game between intelligence services and their targets never ends. It simply evolves into new forms. The story of how Mossad planted a false inmate inside Gaza's prison system to recruit Hamas operatives reveals the extraordinary lengths intelligence services go to in penetrating their adversaries. It's a reminder that in the shadows, reality often exceeds anything screenwriters could imagine. If this story fascinated you, check out our other deep dives into real espionage operations, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Until next time, remember, in the world of intelligence, nothing is ever quite what it seems.